Listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us and welcome to this webinar brought to you by Make Business, part of Make UK, the manufacturers organisation. I'm Ellie Lovett and I'll be chairing the presentation today. Now, the webinar is to help health and safety managers and professionals responsible for health and safety to explore and dispel some of the myths surrounding COSHH risk assessments and the use of safety data sheets. And as you all know, it is a legal requirement that businesses regularly perform COSHH risk assessments in their workplace. Recent changes in the law and COSHH have brought in the use of labelling on chemicals and the use of safety data sheets to help businesses determine the type of chemicals used and how to use the chemical safely. Many businesses rely on data data sheets as guidance. However, following a recent audit, many found that misunderstood the guidance, the data didn't provide the right clarity, and it was subsequently a little bit unreliable. So we're exploring all this today in the webinar. Before we start though, I'd like to draw your attention to a couple of points. So firstly, you'll notice that the panel will be right on your screen. The webinar is being recorded. You will be sent a link to the recording after the webinar today. There are lots of us online and we are keen that you interact with us as much as possible. So there will be a series of polling questions that you can take part in today. So please do, when you see them pop up on your screen, provide your responses so we can discuss the outcomes further today. Please don't forget to send in your own questions to our presenter as well using the chat box feature, and we'll answer questions as soon as we can today. Now I'm pleased to introduce and hand over to Ian Cook, one of our health and safety consultants from our health and safety team today, who will be presenting today's webinar. Over to you, Ian.
Thanks, Ellie, and welcome everybody to today's webinar. What we're going to cover today is some of the basic tips of keeping your workforce safe and the expert advice on managing the risk and use of chemicals within your business, and some of the guidance notes that exist. A lot of the slides today have been taken from a variety of sources and guidance notes that are most part freely available. But if there's any questions, obviously today, please feel free to ask. So a bit of background. The story so far. Modern life would not be possible without the use of chemicals. Plastics and other synthetic materials, including textile fibers, building materials, surround us and are part of our everyday lives. Most consumer products are derived from chemical production, from personal care such as moisturizers and makeups, to electronic products, detergents, and do-it-yourself consumables. Agrochemicals help crops resist pests and disease and promote higher yields. Pharmaceuticals are essential in human and animal healthcare. The list of applications is endless. And as I'm sure you're aware, some of these chemicals can be persistent and stay in the environment for long periods. Take the current global challenge around plastics. Plastics are very persistent and hence create a challenge as we produce them at a rate faster than the environment can consume. So with population growth and global demand for chemicals rising, the risk from chemical use also increases. The UN stated they have major cause for concern around chemical management. So if we look at that growth, around 2006, if we look at the data that was tracking exports, we're actually around 67% higher now in total volume. It stands at $3.47 trillion worth of sales, which is a large amount. So it's a huge contributor to world economies. The prediction for future growth is to see that rise to in 2030 to 6.6 trillion. So again, it's just short of a doubling again over that period, which it shows the amount of chemicals we're producing and transporting around the globe, and obviously also using in the workplace and at home. China is on its 13th five-year plan for their petroleum and chemical industry, and this fits with their long-term vision of Made in China 2025 strategy. I'm sure we're all familiar with the Made in China logo. They are looking to move from following the lead to taking the lead, and from a big country to a great power of the petroleum and chemical industries, leading on technology and innovation and trade, and prevailing in international markets. So how does this affect us? How does this affect you, UK business? Well, today's presentation will look at this from a user's perspective. Wherever the chemical comes from around the world, it's important for us to know we have the correct information about its manufacture so we can then assess the risks of use. Thankfully, a lot of the legislation now that exists ensures that chemical information is provided in a standard format. So we can be confident the information we have is comprehensive and conforms to standards. So as a user, what do we need to do? What we've done here today's webinar is break the story into 6 chapters really. So a user can create a kind of logical process in their business to manage chemical use. As we've just seen, chemicals are coming from a number of places around the world, predominantly China, yes, and predominantly more so in the future. But wherever they are supplied from, wherever your supplier, whether it's local down the road, what do we do as a user? So 6 simple steps. First and foremost, create an inventory of all the substances you use. This may also include substances you create as a byproduct or as a secondary part of a process. Obtain the relevant safety data sheets and evaluate. And today's webinar, we're going to look in a bit more detail at those sections. Thirdly, assess uses. So what do you do with it once you have purchased the chemical? This is you as a business. Everybody purchases the same chemical from a supplier. What you do with it on your site is the difference. You can choose to do it in a different way, a different process, use a different applicator. So we need to understand, what do we do with it? What are our uses? Then we're going to look at what obviously risks you've created from those uses and select appropriate controls to reduce risk. 5th chapter will be inform and instruct, train and monitor, which for most of the safety professionals listening today will know those key points, and we'll look at it from a chemical perspective. And 6, action, tracker and improvements. So we look to recognise there are going to be constant changes and challenges on how we use chemicals, and workers' health could be affected by the use. So how can we constantly improve, really? So they're the 6 chapters. If we move on to the first one, then just take a little bit of a look at the inventory. What we're doing here in this section is to look to create a register which can be easily audited and can manage all of your substances and mixtures in your business. When we say audited, if essentially a chemical is not on the list, it doesn't get in. So a bit like how a bouncer works on a nightclub, the company should be the same. If you haven't got a known substance, or if you have an unknown substance in your site, you should obviously look to remove that substance till you've identified what it is and the appropriate information that comes with that. So the inventory is a register of all substances you use and any byproducts you might create. It will list obviously the basic housekeeping information, such as the name of the substance, the address of the supplier. If there's a CAS number or INIX number, these are 2 in Europe. We have the INIX. CAS is an international system. These both give a unique identification number for that substance. That means you can be sure that you are looking at the right safety data sheet for the substance you have on your shelf, because that unique identifier should correlate to any relevant information. So that's important. It is an important point to make that not all substances will have CAS numbers and so on, because there isn't a comprehensive list for every substance, but CAS is one of the most comprehensive ones out there. You might list how much you have of the substance and how much you buy in. And the hazard classification is important on your inventory, because you want to be highlighting serious risk and looking after those chemicals that pose the greatest threat to you, your business and your workers. So we will look at how to do that later, as I say, on assess uses and risk. You then may list here what uses you allow or permit of those chemicals, or what you do not permit, what you prohibit. And a bit of housekeeping, you might include here something like safety data sheet obtained, or have you done a COSHH risk assessment, yes or no. So if we move on then to chapter 2, so after you've created inventory, which I think is an important starting point, we're going to look to obtain, as I say, the safety data sheet and evaluate. So a safety data sheet should be written in the country's language where it's provided. That's a legal requirement. The supplier must provide it in English if it's providing it into England, and to any other country it supplies, it must do the same. So other versions may be available. If you have a workforce that speak other languages, English is not their first language, you may be able to ask the supplier for a copy of that, and that will help you in terms of communicating clearly some of the risks. You don't have to necessarily translate yourself. That will have been done for you if you have large numbers of workers that speak other languages. The safety data sheet itself is not a COSHH risk assessment. I know most of you will know that, but it is not. It will not suffice an inspection by an enforcement officer. You will need to create some form of assessment yourself, but the safety data sheet will highlight those hazards and precautions and help with your COSHH risk assessment. And I'll come on to how to do a COSHH risk assessment or some of the basic steps later on today. Companies can also contact suppliers if anything is confusing or contradictory on a safety data sheet. And this is the point Ellie made earlier, that when safety data sheets were audited by the regulatory authorities, that was ECHA, by the way. If people want to look at this, there is a report available from ECHA. They found safety data sheets didn't contain all the information that users require, particularly around exposure scenarios and how to really take simple information away from the safety data sheet to use practically. So it was sometimes a bit misleading or a bit too technical and not maybe simple enough. But if you feel it's a bit confusing or technical, the answer is you contact the supplier and ask them the question that, does this cover the use of your chemical? Have they considered your use of it? And if you find the answer is no, it's not considered, then you may need to look at a bit more of a detailed assessment, which is obviously where someone like Make UK could help, or another consultancy. The SDS should be provided on first delivery and resupplied if anything changes. So if any of the hazardous properties of the chemical change, the supplier will, or should I say, supply you with an updated version. Information could change because the way the chemical was tested in the laboratory may not have been as accurate as it could have been, so the data may not be as reliable. Therefore, they've found that the substance is safer or more dangerous than originally thought, so the category may have changed. And that's something that's going on as we speak. All substances, and the testing is being verified and validated. So sometimes they will change.
I think it's a really good point, Ian, to just at this point in time, if we can just start our first polling question and get people's take on use of data within an SDS a safety data sheet. So I'm just going to launch that before we go on to the next slide, if that's okay. So let me just choose this. So, okay, on your screens you should see the first polling question. So, do you find the data within SDS useful? Great, I can see some responses coming through now. I'll just give you a couple more seconds to respond, and that's great. And I'll close those now and share with you the results of that. So, Ian, the results that we have are that actually 93% said that the data within the SDS was useful, with 70% saying no. Is that quite reasonable to understand that that might be the right responses there?
Yes. Well, it's hard to say without looking at some of the businesses that have responded there. I think, yes, they are useful. So the information that is given to users is useful. The query becomes on companies when you're auditing all of the information within the safety data sheet. Is it all accurate? Does it all complement each other? And I think there's been some companies that have rejected around 40% of safety data sheets.
Right.
So they have an occupational health department that may review those. There's a couple of organisations that I've worked with, and about 40% of safety data sheets that come in have been rejected based on incorrect information. Right. That begs the question, do we know what we're looking for in them? But it's pleasing to hear the respondents saying, yes, it is useful, because I think it is a positive. It is a great step. The safety data sheets are useful. They are helping users. So that's probably a good answer to hear, really.
Yeah, that is positive. Thank you, everybody, for taking part in that poll. I'll let Ian continue as we go into a bit more detail around safety data sheets and the 16 main headings.
Thanks, Ellie. And that's what we're going to look at here. So it's pleasing to hear that most of you find safety data sheets useful. what we took the approach of with this webinar today was to focus on some of the key sections that people really obviously should be paying attention to, particularly as a user of the substance in its standard format. So if you're not processing the chemical or mixing it with others, if you're just using it as an application as it's meant for, then when you're doing your COSHH risk assessments, these are some of the key sections within a safety data sheet we feel users should be focusing on. So if we look at section 1 here, I haven't got a separate slide for this, it's just really administration. So if we think of the inventory we were talking about earlier, this is where you will take that information from the safety data sheet, such as the identification of the substance, its trade name, the mixtures that might be apparent, and the undertaking, or the uses as it's often called, which is section 1.2 for anyone. Here we should look at the supplier's notes on the uses of the chemical, and they may also show the prohibitions. So in other words, what it shouldn't be used for. They're really important to know. Simple sort of housekeeping, but very important information to be transferred over to your either inventory and or COSHH risk assessment. Depends what type of form you use for your COSHH risk assessment. So an important point. What I'm not going to do is go through some of those ones that aren't in bold. So if we just took a couple of examples, section 3 here, composition information, it's not usually needed for health and safety professionals. This would be for your sort of scientists, engineers, or people who, again, who are processing the substance and maybe mixing with other substances, creating mixtures or applying heat, creating situations where you might be releasing those ingredients. Section 5 is another example of where not usually required for health and safety professionals. Firefighting measures, obviously a competent fire engineer or fire professional will know this information. However, there may be some useful information here, such as extinguishing media, that may be important for you to be aware of to ensure you have the correct extinguishing media on site. So this is what I say, I'm not dismissing those other sections here today, and you probably would look through these anyway as a user, I'm sure. But sometimes we've found companies get obviously a lot of information here. Which bit should we be really focusing on? Hence why we've put those in bold for us today. So if you do have questions about the other sections, feel free to get in touch with us here and we'll try and answer those. Moving on then to section 2 then of the safety data sheet. We are still on chapter 2 of our overall story. We're just taking a bit of a detailed look at these sections now. And if we look at, say, section 2, what we're looking for here is the hazard identification. So we're looking at the pictograms that come with the actual substance, labeled onto the product, labeled onto the transport information, on the packaging that might come with your substance, and we're going to check they all match. Here, section 2 gives details of these hazards associated with a chemical and the potential effects and symptoms it may cause. As a user, this information is really what you use to assess the risk. Each symbol only tells part of the story though. So each label has a number of subsections. For example, toxic substances are split into 5 subcategories. Category 1 to 3 of a toxic substance is the skull and crossbones that you can see on the screen there. Whereas category 4 toxic substance will use the exclamation mark health hazard, which is sort of the bottom left pictogram there. And category 5 toxic won't actually use one of these symbols. Category 5 toxic would simply say warning, which is a signal word. And there are signal words such as danger and warning. Danger is obviously for more severe substances, warning for obviously less severe. So they've tried to create this simple alert to any users of a potential danger of the substance, but on their own, they aren't necessarily going to tell you a great deal, but they are going to be the alert for you. That is really where you don't have to assess the risk per se, because what I think of it is the gross risk has been assessed by the supplier. Now, just before I move on here from this slide, there is a free link, or a link to a free quiz, should I say. All links are free, I think. It's a link to a free quiz where you can share with your colleagues at work this quiz on these pictograms, which is a bit of fun, but it can create some awareness around these particular symbols. So anyone listening today, it's a useful resource and a bit of fun as well, which is good. Okay, So if I just move on then, what's important from these pictograms is to look at the hazard statements and precautionary statements. So we've just highlighted that the substance we've purchased has gone onto our inventory. It's got some labels. We've looked at those labels, realized they're obviously hazardous, there's a signal word, and breaking those subcategories into what does it mean, what is the risk? Well, what they've done in the global system is create really three main types of hazards: physical hazard, health hazard, and environmental hazard. And each of those has its own number sequence. So you can see there, physical hazards are 200s, health hazards are 300s, and environmental hazards are 400s. Just to give you an example of some of those, H221, that's how they're displayed. H would be health hazard, hazard statement. For a physical hazard, H221 would be flammable gas, whereas H330 would be fatal if inhaled, so a health hazard. And for an environmental one, we would have H401, toxic to aquatic life. Now, on a safety data sheet, they will be in this section 2, as I've discussed. They may be repeated again in section 16, but section 2 is where they should be clearly itemized with the pictogram, with the associated pictogram. And then obviously what's important for you to understand is they are the kind of hazards, but also what are the precautions. And again, these have been grouped to make it easy for users. So the number sequencing is obviously the hundreds is general precautionary statements. Give you an example of that. P101, if medical advice is needed, have product container or label at hand. So that's important, isn't it? I think if you do have an incident with that chemical, we should have a copy of the product container or label to hand, or some information that has copied that information over. So any treatment can deal with those issues, and the medical practitioners are aware of the challenges there. There's obviously other ones, prevention and response, storage precautionary statements, 400s, for example, P410, protect from sunlight, and disposal precautionary statements. So you will find there are other sections as we move on. So disposal we're going to cover today, an important one. And you should see the safety data sheet really almost confirming to itself, repeating itself, the correct information here. So there's some ways you can test the information from the supplier. The disposal information here should match section 13 when we get there, disposal considerations. So a tip, important information to communicate, say via information leaflets or summary information cards, are these kind of physical hazards and precautions. You can simplify it into your own language would be my advice. So if we'd said fatal if inhaled, then I think we know what the precautions probably will be, and we may also need to ensure that those are mandatory, supervised, monitored with appropriate signage, health surveillance, and all of the other controls that are in place. Now, we can create a small card infographic that is placed in the workplace to ensure workers really are aware of these hazards and precautions. So these are the key focus points. Section 2, very important on a safety data sheet.
Thanks, Ian. Before we go on to the next section around first aid measure, I just want to launch the next polling question. So I'll launch that now for you. So on your screen, you should be able to see it now. So how do you evaluate risk on COSHH risk assessments? Do you use quantitative or qualitative scoring to indicate risk? Do you use hazard statements as an indication of risk perhaps? Or do you use words such as high, low and medium to indicate that there's a risk? Just give you a couple more seconds to respond. Okay, I'll close that now. Thank you very much, and share with you the details. Okay, so Ian, use of quantitative or qualitative scoring to indicate risk, 38%. Use of hazardous statements as an indication of risk, 8%. And using the words high, low, and medium to indicate that risk is at 54%. Do you have any thoughts or responses to the answers on that poll?
Yes, it's not for me to say which is right or wrong. I would urge people to obviously ensure they've how they assess risk is mapped to those hazard statements. So if I just move back a slide, actually, the hazard statements there are actually grouped into hazard bands, which we'll come on to. So I'll explain the hazard bands later in the webinar. And if your assessment quantitatively, qualitatively, or however you may do, high, medium, low, reflects those hazard bands, which I'll show you, as I say, later, then that would be, in my opinion, the correct way to assess risk from these chemicals.
Great. Thanks, Ian.
That's okay. So moving on then to first aid measures, you know, I think an important one for you to be aware of, obviously, if immediate medical attention is needed, it will cover things such as delayed effects that could be seen in an employee after exposure, and what personal protective equipment the first aid responders need to wear, which is an important one. Sometimes I've seen first aid stations that don't have the required PPE nearby that might be needed if there is an incident where you could think of a release or a spillage. So the first aid responders will need that PPE that's highlighted in the precautionary statements. Tip, have a copy of the safety data sheet or notes for a doctor available to hand, as I say, to make sure they have the required information and know how to treat someone. Moving on to section 6, which is accidental release. This is important information around how you put in engineering controls in your workplace, such as bunding, bund walls, irrigation systems to prevent, firstly, the spill or ensure containment of the substance. It will cover PPE requirements again, removal of ignition sources, ventilation requirements, and spill kits required. So again, there are lots of spill kits on the market. I have known some instances where the spill kit itself mixed with the chemical creates a byproduct which is a hazard. So actually the spill kit compatibility with the substance is very important. Otherwise you can actually create another hazardous substance. The tip here is, as we've said, really, don't forget to store the relevant PPE for spill kits as well. So first aid spill kits, it really is important to make sure those workers are protected that are going to have to deal with maybe even higher levels of exposure than the users themselves. Next section, handling and storage. So safe handling and storage is obviously important, and the information on the safety data sheet here will look to ensure that the storage is suitable to prevent vapor and dust release, which is obviously a physical and health risk. So you could find vapors and dusts are explosive and or create a health hazard as well. It will tell you here about how to avoid storage of incompatible substances, storage of mixed substances, and what to avoid in terms of dangerous conditions. Dangerous conditions and possibly operations, you know, things such as radiant heat, or even storage away from drains and things like that. An important point here is the occupational hygiene and what workers should be doing in terms of avoiding eating, drinking or smoking, washing their hands, and remove contaminated clothing before entering eating areas or restaurants. So lots of important information there. The tip here is this information is based upon the identified uses of the substance. So if you're using the substance outside its identified use, which should be highlighted in section 1.2, and this section 7.3, so it should be here. But if you're using the substance outside its identified use, be careful about the storage requirements here, because larger quantities or in certain conditions could mean the advice on the safety data sheet may not apply, and you need to apply special measures. So again, it's always important just to check with the supplier that the use you are using it for is what they've covered on the safety data sheet. Okay, so moving on to section 8, exposure controls. There's probably an important point to make here first is occupational exposure limits, which is where a lot of people find the information on safety data sheets quite challenging on how to interpret occupational exposure limits. That's often because there's a number of different exposure limit values given. They could be TLV, American values, or European indicative occupational exposure values, or occupational exposure values for the UK. The supplier legally must provide the country's occupational exposure limits if they exist. So if you're aware of an exposure limit for this substance and it's not on the safety data sheet, you really do need to contact the supplier they've obviously made a mistake on the safety data sheet. If they're providing you with lots of information, again, you're not quite sure which one applies to you, then you can query it with them and make sure you know that the UK one, or whichever country of operation you're in, is the one that applies if they've provided numerous ones. It also may provide monitoring procedures such as observation methods. These monitoring methods can be personal air sampling, room air sampling, biological monitoring, any applicable monitoring techniques that are required. And then the exposure controls will come on to as we talk about assessing risk. But in summary, it really is looking at the appropriate engineering controls, such as substance and mixture related measures in process or batch reactors, LEV systems, structural measures to prevent exposure. And then you're onto organizational measures, reduce time, work patterns, and then the kind of technical measures. This can include PPE, and there's a lot of guidance around the type of PPE that will go in there. So most safety professionals, I'm sure you're familiar with the hierarchy of control. It is important, I think, at this point to say we should always look to reduce the exposure of substances as low as is reasonably practicable, because although the occupational exposure limits will show us safe levels in terms of hopefully long-term use of these substances, we do know certain individuals will be more susceptible than others, and therefore as an employer, as a safety professional, there's an obligation legally and morally just to reduce the exposure to as low as possible to ensure no one is affected by these substances. So that is an important point I think I should add there, which I'm sure you're aware. So moving on to our last section in our safety data sheet, disposal considerations. Similar to the storage requirements in section 7, we need to ensure obviously the safe storage of waste, because we're still going to attempt to prevent pollution or contamination of other waste streams, or still the risks that it might pose to workers or the business. This section will give you lots of information about prevention of the vapor and dust release, storage of incompatible substances, waste substances, and dangerous conditions. So very similar, as I say, to section 7. So the important bit here really to highlight would be to check any contractor who disposes of waste for your business. Obviously, when you hand over your waste to a contractor, technically there are still some issues which you are legally responsible for. It is your waste. So you can check the contractor who disposes of it, audit them, inspect them, and what you're really looking for is checking the final location that they're taking the waste to has the correct registration for that substance, for that type of waste. And there is a publicly available register of sites and what waste they can take. So you can actually do some of this from a desktop, but important to check that the contractor taking your waste away from site is doing what they say they're doing. So on to chapter 3, we're back into the main chapter of the 6 headings. I'll just pause there for a second, just so people can, we'll just think of chapter 1 was the inventory, chapter 2 was the safety data sheet and evaluate, which we've just been through some of the key headings there. And if you've done those, you've added your safety data sheet and chemical to the inventory. We're now really looking at what do you do with this chemical and what are its uses. So there could be, for substances that are provided in larger quantities, the supplier may have created what we call exposure scenarios. These are where the predicted use of the chemical is known. They will provide a scenario for you, giving information about what you should be doing in terms of keeping people safe. These are called exposure scenarios, and often going to be in section 16 on our safety data sheet. If we haven't got that, the user will need to do a bit more detail in assessing the use. And what we've done here is create some simple steps for how to do that. And if we look at the first step, identify the uses you have. You may buy one chemical and you may have 3 uses. Therefore, you're going to need to have 3 assessments, because each use may have different people using it, different applications or applicators that you apply the chemicals, and therefore each one could have its own unique risk. So once you've identified the number of uses, again, we could add this to the inventory, as you may have saw earlier, and we can then look at the kind of potential scenarios that could occur during that use. So we look at the hazard information on the safety data sheet, the second step here, review hazard statements and exposure limits. And we're really looking at those physical, health and environmental. And we can see here, if we took those hazard statements, what kind of risks we could expect to see during our use. We can then, on the third step, create exposure scenarios. This is a technical description of the processes or activities that you carry out and the operational conditions that you might encounter during your use. And if some of those start to create, say, temperature or heat, and you've got a flammable substance, then quite simply you know you're creating additional risk that you might need to look to control. You then look to estimate exposure. This is really important in terms of UK law. If workers are working with substances every day, the likelihood of exposure is going to be high. I'm not always a big fan of trying to predict likelihood in terms of 1 to 5 or 1 to 10 risk assessments. If people are using the substance on a regular basis, the likelihood is high. So it's more about frequency and how often, and then looking at really the severity. So if the severity is high, and we are using it, you could say there's a likelihood of that severity happening anyway. So getting too technical on the quantitative assessments is where sometimes I find people over or underestimating risk. So sometimes section 9 of the safety data sheet can provide physical and chemical properties of the substance, which may be helpful in this section on estimating exposure, but it's for you to look at routes of exposure. How could the individual be exposed? Are they going to breathe it in? Is it going to come onto their skin? Sometimes using video technology to film them while they're applying the chemical can give you indications of possible exposure routes. And then characterize the risk. So the last point here. Compare estimated exposure levels with the hazard information. This might show if you're controlling the risk suitably. The precautionary statements given on the safety data sheet will tell you often what simple precautions need to be in place for stated use. But if you're creating more difficult situations, confined spaces where you might be using it, or if you have other hazards present, such as machines, then other PPE that your workers are wearing could affect the suitability of the PPE recommended by the supplier. So you've got to look at this in the whole. More information on risk characterization, by the way, is freely available from ECHA. And it's also good to know the HSE's COSHH Essentials are obviously well regarded globally. So if you're a UK company listening today, UK HSE COSHH Essentials plus the other guidance there is great ways to look at these steps of risk assessment and characterize risk. The tip here is obviously to split them into those 3 groups we talked about. If the safety data sheets have been written in this way, why would somebody make it any more complicated? So if you can break your risks down into physiochemical, so we're talking about explosives and fire, health, and environmental, then that can be easier to manage this throughout the use. Simple creation of a step-by-step sequence like step 1, open lid, step 2, apply to a brush, step 3, paint, step 4, and so on, and then look at those potential risks throughout the process. And there you have an exposure scenario. Moving on to selecting the appropriate controls, this is the hazard banding that I mentioned earlier. So there is actually an agreed or recognized list of H phrases that fall into certain categories of risk. So I've put a few examples on the screen here for people to have a look. A high risk hazard banding would include, as you would expect, 310, fatal in contact with the skin. I think we'd all agree that's high risk. Another example there is 340, may cause genetic defects. Okay, and then you can see on the right-hand side a general control. So in terms of our controls for this, it's really about eliminating exposure because of the danger here. Very high levels of containment required. So if we're looking at engineering controls, we should be looking at no contact or booths or fume cupboards. design closed systems to allow for easy maintenance, so we can contain the substance in a very well controlled area. And again, you can see medium and low. So there is a logic here that you don't have to do your own risk assessments. The polling question earlier said quite a lot of you are doing quantitatively and qualitatively assessing risk. Well, using these kind of models, actually that is taken out of your hands, and what you can focus on, importantly, is the controls and ensuring you can apply those controls to reduce risk. So this is where I would urge companies to consider the hazard banding. It also makes it a lot easier for your users to do COSHH risk assessments. If you have a form that automatically highlights a red, amber, green system, if you've got a substance that contains a H phrase that's in the high banding, then automatically you've got a high risk, and automatically you need to apply the relevant controls there. So I hope that makes sense to people. I think that's a really important point and something I've seen used very successfully in our member businesses.
Thanks, Ian. Right, we're going to do our very last polling question. I can see some questions from the audience coming through from attendees, so we will get round to answering them at the end of the webinar, and if we don't, we'll certainly make sure that we get answers to you as soon as possible. So I'm just going to launch the next polling question. Okay, so how do you ensure workers are following the control measures? Do you use regular supervision? You might think about using audits. Do you involve others in the risk assessment process? Do you carry out health surveillance perhaps, or do you do collaborative monitoring, so reviewing tasks for improvements collaboratively within a team? Lots of responses coming through. Thank you very much, and I'll just close that now and share the results. Okay, so in terms of responses for that question, how do you ensure workers are following the control measures? 68% said regular supervision, 95% said audits, very popular one there. 74% said involving others in risk assessment process, which is brilliant. 53% was for both carrying out health surveillance and also the collaborative monitoring around reviewing tasks and improvements. Any feedback and thoughts on those responses from you, Ian?
No, we clearly have a very good audience today.
Yeah.
So no, I think that's good. Regular supervision around 68%, I think would be one point I'd just probably highlight, because I think that is something which is, there's no chemical that's hazardous to health that shouldn't be supervised. So there's a level of risk with all of them. So there's hopefully all users are checking the controls at some level, maybe not daily, maybe not weekly, but are auditing and inspecting at some level. So no, that's good.
Great. Thanks, Ian.
Okay, thanks, Ellie. Moving on then, which appropriately talks about the requirement to inform, instruct, train and monitor, which again, a lot of the audience are probably familiar with these terms in safety, but just some practical tips really of what we've seen. So I think if you look at the middle picture there, the instruction, it's much easier, I think, to inform people this day and age and instruct them with graphics, pictures, and potentially on the right there, videos. Safe systems of work that are written down in text and lots of words are hard to understand and follow unless you have a level of competency. So creating simple pictograms or video files that show and instruct people how to do it, I think is really important. And that creates an honesty as well, a good culture of communication between workers where you can talk about how to do a task, film it, share that appropriate way of doing it, and then educate others on the right steps. It creates sort of a very transparent and good communication across the workforce. Another tip here is the QR codes. So some businesses, I see they have lots of information, copies of safety data sheets, COSHH risk assessments. Sometimes it's information overload. I would go back to what I was talking about earlier about summary cards, or something which is very simple, highlighting the key hazards, the key precautions, first aid measures, and maybe disposal measures, and just some of the key points we've discussed today, really. Very simple, one-side sheet highlighting those key points. And then with a QR code on the bottom of that sheet, people can link through to your shared drive where copies of the risk assessments, the inventory, safety data sheets, technical, chemical safety reports, or any other information that may be relevant can be kept. And if you've got one master copy, we know if we're updating those, then you're not having to reprint and walk around the site updating and replacing old paper copies. It's just one repository for all your information. And I think that's a very useful tool, which is actually, for most cases, you can get free versions of these QR codes. Obviously, more advanced ones do more, and they cost a bit more money, but quite cost effective. So moving on to our next section, which is our last chapter in these 6, is the action tracker and improvements. So of course, if we've created an inventory, we've checked we've got a safety data sheet, we've checked our uses, we've gone through all of the kind of controls that are required to be put in place to ensure we're protecting workers or eliminating the use of those chemicals where we can, and so on and so on. And then we're informing, instructing, training, supervising all of our staff. The last bit is constant improvement, isn't it? Continuous improvement. So how do organisations do this? Well, there's a number of ways. There's apps available now, there's software. We do use software with some of our member companies that allows us, our advisors, to see if there's issues real time, which means we can get in touch with them very quickly. There's other apps that report straight to area managers, or even some that report up into their global reporting systems. So lots of technology available now, but even a simple form that can be available, like an ID, a hazard ID form that's a piece of paper around the site, maybe pocket size, so people can carry a few in the pocket and then drop them into a letterbox. There's lots of different techniques that should identify the process, department or chemical, what their concern is, what the challenge is. They may know the suggested improvement. Most of the time, the workers know the best improvement to make, so let them give them the opportunity to suggest an improvement. And then for you as an action tracker, obviously as a safety professional or some department that takes responsibility, a line manager, they need to create target dates and responsibility to get this done. It's really, I think there's 2 points below though, and the first one, feedback from workers. It's important for the employer to acknowledge the feedback, even if that's, thank you for your feedback, sorry we can't quite do it now, we are going to look into this. If you do that, you're closing the feedback loop and you'll make sure feedback continues to flow. So if you don't do that, people will stop feeding back and you won't hear improvements and you won't know what's going on. So if, as it said in the survey earlier, if my maths is right, 32% of you are not supervising, then I hope you've got good staff and good feedback loops that's working so you don't have to constantly check. And talking about checking, audits, inspections, surveys. So then obviously it's important you audit your chemical management system. We've just been through a simple 6-stage process. That could be the basis of your company standard. If you have a company standard on chemical management, it's important you audit that process and check that it's working for you and it's being used by people. And inspect. So inspections obviously slightly different. You might be inspecting PPE usage, PPE storage, chemical storage. You might do weekly, monthly checks, depending on risk. Again, if your inventory has highlighted risk, as we've suggested, high, medium, low. If you have those hazard statements in the high banding, then your inspections will be more frequent. And then surveys, so staff surveys, questionnaires, checking on workers' exposure. Are they showing signs and symptoms? Look for some honesty around this. Have they a particular chemical in there which does require health monitoring, health surveillance that a survey may support your information on, and how good your controls are in terms of protecting workers. So I think with regards to the 6 chapters, we're sort of at an end there. I hope that covers off a process and a logic which makes sense to everyone. If not, please feel free to ask some questions, because I think
Indeed, thank you for that. And it is indeed question time now, and there are a few that have come through. So without further ado, I'll ask the questions, Ian, from our attendees today. Hi, Peter. A couple of questions from Peter here. So what responsibilities does a user have under REACH? Is it just sufficient to obtain the MSDS and assume that REACH registration / authorization is in place?
Good question. So yes, MSDS and SDS are the same thing. So for people, yes, you can, as a user, checking REACH registration is something you can look into if you wish to check the suitability of a supplier. But as a downstream user from your supplier, you would presume if there is a safety data sheet, there should also be a number that tells them, so a registration number, which will be on the safety data sheet under section 1, I believe. So you can look to see if there's a registration number there. If there isn't one, then you could go back to the supplier and query what registration process they've been through. And it'll also depend on what amount of substance there is. I think all substances greater than a ton now, as of June 2018, should be registered. So if the supplier is providing it in larger quantities than a ton, it should have been registered. It should have the correct 16 heading safety data sheet and all of the information we've discussed today. That would be an indication they have been through the process correctly.
That's really good. Thanks, Ian. Peter, I hope that helps answer your question. Another thing interesting that Peter mentions was in the recent health and safety research conducted showed that only 17% of the MSDSs surveyed were legally compliant. So in other words, 83% of the 1,700 SDS were non-compliant. So wow, that's quite shocking figures, I think.
Yeah, that was, I didn't know that exact number, but I did know there was a large quantity of them, hence the reason we chose to put this webinar on, I think.
Absolutely.
To try and highlight some of the key points in the safety data sheet. So yeah. I didn't actually know those numbers. That's a lot higher than I thought it would be. But
yes, indeed,
yeah,
indeed.
I was a bit skeptical, but I won't quote anything on the webinar.
Fair enough. Just to mention as well to all attendees, there is a handout that we have today. If you've not already seen that and downloaded it, it is on the 16 main headings, just to give a helpful indication of the things you should be adding into those sections, and of course the ones that Ian's discussed throughout the webinar today. We just have another question as well from Paul. Hi, Paul. So he asks, if I am only storing the chemical, there is no activity taking place in the COSHH risk assessment still required, or will just having a copy of the SDS be acceptable?
Well, I would say that you are, by storing it, you still have a requirement to carry out an assessment of the risks that you might create, because it isn't on the use side. So your risk assessment will not be the slide where I showed the steps on how to assess use. It wouldn't necessarily be that format, but you need to look at and consider what activities are going on around your storage areas. So are there any other risks like movement of vehicles that could impact onto those storage areas? Are you storing other chemicals nearby that may not be suitable? So particularly focusing on the storage, potentially looking at accidental release section, potentially looking at disposal considerations if you are disposing of it at some point, or if you're just, if it's just passing through, so to speak. First aid, fire precautions you might need to consider, because obviously in an emergency or an incident, an unplanned incident, you may need to consider. You do need to do some assessment of risk, but it won't be on the use.
Great. Thanks, Ian. Paul, I hope that was useful. Indeed, is there any other support that you need for that on advice? And Ian will be happy to give that to you, and his email details, contact details are at the end of this webinar, and on the slide 2 of the webinar slide deck as well. You'll be getting a recording of the webinar, so you'll be able to get those details off there if you need to. There's a couple of other kind of questions that we've got around getting staff involved. So you mentioned about audits, inspections and surveys, feedback from workers, and the mechanisms and things that you can put in place, whether it's through a system or having simple sheets that you can have in your back pocket, that kind of thing. But what is it that you think really does work from your experience? What is it that you've helped organisations to implement that you think has really ticked those boxes and engaged the workplace to and educate them for safe working?
So I think focusing on 1 or 2 topics maximum. So let's not try and educate everybody in the business on the technicalities of chemical management. Let's pick 1 or 2 things, such as good hygiene, looking after your skin, thinking about breathing. So your breathing or your skin could be 2 topics. Pick 1 of them, focus on that, and ensure people really understand what it means to look after their health. If you can get people to look after their own health, most people automatically will always look after others. So focus on their own health, get people to look, wash their hands, think about breathing. If you have particular, dangerous chemicals that people might be breathing in, focus on the breathing side. If it's more about the skin contact, focus on that. Just stick to one topic, but really implement a company-wide program where everyone is checking everybody else. They're looking after each other. They're willing to challenge each other and also be challenged. That's the key bit to it. Not just challenge somebody else for not wearing the gloves. Be happy to be challenged that you're not wearing gloves. And that kind of culture just on one aspect will actually hopefully be transferable to other areas. If you get people operating safely like that in one area, you'll find it'll impact on other areas of safety naturally anyway. So let's not try and do it all. Let's just pick one or two. And I would suggest you pick one or two topics that are really relevant to you and get them involved that way.
Great, okay. And just one more broader question, particularly around cost risk assessment, safety data sheets, as we've spoken to before, and obviously the 6 areas that we've focused on at the start of the webinar. Does that also form part of your overall kind of health and safety policy that you should have in place within your workplace?
Yes, I think so. I think depends how you, so the word policy can mean different things, different people. So if you have a statement of intent that you provide to all your staff, I think chemical management, has to be on there, obviously, and how you word that is very positively, and we're going to look after you in terms of substances and articles, but nice and simple terminology if possible. And then if you have a company standard on chemical management, then yes, using those 6 headings could be your management standard, what you're going to do as a company to manage. And that is a document that I think you should create. Depends on how complex your business you are, how many chemicals you have. Yes, those 6 headings could be the start of a company standard.
Right, yes, okay. Great. Okay, well, I think we are just about out of time for this webinar. So final thoughts from you, Ian? Any final thoughts from yourself?
No, nothing. I've got to think of something I can continue.
I know. I've put you on the spot, haven't I?
Yeah, you did that. It is obviously, I think, something which ECHA, it's the European Chemical Agencies, have said on safety data sheets, is they're encouraging suppliers to produce exposure scenarios. So I think, although a lot of the audience said today they find the data useful on safety data sheets, I think you will find it even more useful as we move forward. So I think it's a progressive improvement in information. It's only going to get better, and that's a good thing. So I think it's a positive. But in the meantime, it's just about being diligent in what information you do take from suppliers, safety data sheets, and how you put together your COSHH risk assessments. Keep them simple. Don't scare staff with complex COSHH risk assessments, because then they won't do them, or they'll come up with results that are either overprotective or not protective enough. So I think it's proportionate, sensible management, but recognizing the gross risk that is highlighted on the hazard statements on the safety data sheet. That's the gross risk. That's the real risk, and then any additional risk you might create.
Okay, thank you, Ian, for that final thought. All that's left for me to say is thank you to all the attendees that have taken part in the webinar today and the polling questions. There is the handout, as I mentioned before. If you do have any other questions, do get in contact direct with Ian, or just let us know if there's anything else that we can help with around COSHH or SDS, or indeed any other area of health and safety. There is going to be a short survey in the webinar, so please take time just to answer a couple of questions before you leave today. In a couple of days, you'll have also a email from Make Business just to give you a recording of the webinar and the handout that you can download as well if you've not already done that today, and also a link to our health and safety and environmental briefings that you might be interested in coming along to. We do a legal update, and we also share knowledge and information, and also it's an opportunity for other health and safety professionals and managers to network in a group scenario. So I hope you've enjoyed the webinar today, and have a great day all, and thanks again, Ian, for presenting.
No, that's a pleasure. Thank you all. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Ellie.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye-bye.